And I start with an apology that we have three people with us here, not Omobolanle Victor Lanian from Nigeria, who unfortunately couldn't make it. But I do have an excellent panel. Eva Cairns from Aberdeen, Head of Sustainability, Insight and Climate Strategy. And Aberdeen manage 500 billion?
Over 500 billion.
Over 500 billion. And in companies all around the world?
That's right, globally, yeah.
Yeah, hundreds of companies, thousands of companies?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Probably companies and assets, so real assets as well as companies.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So hundreds or thousands of companies.
Yeah.
And then we've got James Wilde, your Chief Sustainability Officer at Phoenix. James, how many, so an insurance company, how many policyholders?
So we've got 13 million policyholders and about 300 billion of assets under administration.
And about 300, so that's about 13 billion is like 1 in 3 households in Britain or something like that, yeah, equivalent to?
I'd imagine a number of the people in the room have their pension with us, where we invest matters.
Actually, yeah, I am one of those people actually, so I hope you're doing your job very well. I do depend on you because unlike my picture, I will be taking my pension pretty soon. I love coming to these things because the picture, when I come to Scotland to these conferences, I never age. My picture is still one where I'm a young person. So two big investment managers and asset owners from Scotland, and then somebody else, Chris Hayward. Chris is from the City of London. It's an odd beast, the City of London. It is the local authority for that square mile where the financial services of London are based. So it's responsible for the rubbish and the planning and all of those sorts of things that local authorities do. But it has another role as well, which in the context of this conference is really important, which is that it's there to promote the financial services industry, not just of London, but of the whole of Britain. Now, you've seen the Lord Mayor already. The Lord Mayor is sort of the titular head of the City of London and wears the funny clothes and visits the Queen and does all of those sorts of things. But the chief executive, the person who's politically in charge, the Prime Minister, if you like, of the City Corporation of London, is Chris, who's chair of the Policy Committee. So look, I'm going to ask for some really short introductory remarks because we've only got 35 minutes. We can see on our timetable there from each person. And then we're going to do a question time. And I've got some tricky questions to ask them, but I'm really interested in the questions that are coming from the audience. So let me start with 1 or 2 minutes from each of our panelists. And if I can start with you, Chris, just tell us a little bit about the City of London and how you view this big debate about sustainability.
So, David, thank you very much indeed, and can I say what a pleasure it is to be here with you. You've kind of outlined quite a bit about the city and about my own role, so I won't seek to repeat it. It is fair to say that we are the government of the square mile. We provide public services to a very few residents, just 9,000 residents in the square mile, but we have 500,000 workers in the square mile on a daily basis and 22,000 businesses. And my job as the de facto political leader of the City Corporation, and I say de facto because I have 124 other elected colleagues. And here's the rub. None of them represent a political party. They're all independents. So my job as a political leader is akin to herding cats most of the time and trying to bring them together. But we do act as the voice for financial and professional services of the United Kingdom to the government, UK government. And I must say I look forward to working with our partners in the Scottish government going forward. And I just would congratulate them on not only chairing the Glasgow COP, but also the very foresighted way in which they're leading on the net zero agenda, as was outlined by the Culture Secretary. Now, just a quick word about our own City of London Corporation action strategy, climate action strategy. It achieves us in the City Corporation to achieving net zero carbon in our own operations by 2027, and we also aim to become net zero across our investments and supply chain by 2040. and to support the achievement of net zero for the whole square mile by that same year. And we're investing a total of £68 million in order to achieve those climate action objectives. And just very quickly to say, only a couple of weeks ago we published data showing that we've cut our annual carbon emissions by 31% and our overall energy consumption by 21% since 2018. And we've published a first-of-its-kind climate action dashboard, which is also available online, because it includes, and I think this is important with all of what we're talking about, independently verified data that actually backs up the transparent account of what we're delivering on. So lots to do, but that's a little bit about it.
A practical plan there, Chris, from a local authority. And I want to move on but I'll come back to you about the financial services industry, because I'd like to move on to that question with you, Eva. I mean, is the finance industry on the right track on climate? I mean, you know, we're talking a good game here, but we're getting a lot of criticism for greenwash. I mean, are we having any impact at all in all this stuff we're saying and doing?
I think it's a challenge for the finance industry to actually demonstrate with clarity what's been done with real-world impact. Because when we talk about achieving net zero, we heard this morning from Tarek, you know, divestment, for example, is not really the answer. You could divest pretty quickly and have a low carbon portfolio, and it looks great. It has a temperature score of 1.5 degrees, and you actually haven't moved anything forward in terms of real world impact. We know, and we've heard earlier, that capital needs to go into emerging markets. That's where actually disclosure rates on carbon, for example, are quite low. Okay. I think the battery's gone. Oh, should we stop? Is that better? Yes, I think the battery's gone. So these are some of the real world challenges around actually demonstrating. There's a lot of confusion in terms of terminology, I think, in the industry.
Would you know what impact Aberdeen was having in what it was doing, or is it just impossible to know?
That really depends. So for some funds, there's a lot of work going in. We've got a specific impact fund, a lot of work and hours going into analysing the impact because the data's just not there. So therefore, this drive in the industry to just have a really simple number and transparency, like a temperature number and portfolio alignment, that's a big thing that GFANS is focused on, is a concern that this could really backfire and be misleading because the methodologies aren't mature enough yet. And so there is so much misunderstanding in the industry around what actually some of these terms mean: impact, sustainable outcomes, ESG integration, which can then lead to accusations of greenwashing. Because what you don't see in a simple fund report is maybe the active ownership that's happening, the voting, the policy advocacy that investors are doing, the whole package that is really needed for real-world impact.
That's going to set us up with some really good questions, I hope, from the audience about what the fund management industry is doing. But Chris, also, the fund management industry can't do this on its own, can it? I mean, policy and politicians have got to set a framework here. You can't suddenly start investing people's money. And also, you need to respond to the consumer. I mean, where does the fund management industry sit in, and what do we need other people to be doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really pivotal moment, actually. We heard about GFANS and all of the financial institutions coming forward at the COP with targets. And we were one of those, actually, at Phoenix Group. We were at the COP, our CEO was there presenting our long-term goal to be net zero, but actually it's all about the short-term targets. We set a goal to reduce the carbon emissions of our liquid equity and credit portfolio, 160 billion by 25% by 2025. That's really tangible, because that's during his tenure. And we've measured the carbon footprint of that portfolio. It's 15 million tonnes of CO2. It's equivalent to heating 5.4 million homes. So it gives you a sense of scale. We heard earlier about the kind of levers we can pull to reduce those emissions. We can tilt our portfolios to make sure we're supporting the winners, not the losers in the transition. Active engagement's really important. As a large owner, we can go direct, but we can collaborate with others to do it collectively, more powerful. And then also with all our asset managers, we have a pool of asset managers. We can coordinate them and work closely with them. But direct investment is really important. We work with the ABI and colleagues across the industry and found that our sector, the kind of long-term savings and retirement sector, could provide a third of the 2.7 trillion required to be invested in the UK over the next 15 years in the net zero transition. But to make that happen, and we heard it from the ex-BlackRock employee earlier, we need strong policy to make it attractive to invest at scale. We need adjustments in financial regulation. We need attractive. Offshore wind is probably the only large-scale renewable technology where it's really attractive to invest at scale. And finance has been a big part of the reduction in cost of that technology. It's been astonishing. I've worked on offshore wind for the last 20 years. The cost has moved from 150 megawatts, 150 pounds per megawatt to 40 pounds per megawatt in the last 5 years. Part of that is having a really stable policy framework that reduces risk. That means that our long-term patient capital can come in at low cost and bring down that cost, as well as the industry mobilizing, innovating, and getting economies of scale by delivering at scale. So I think our industry working collaboratively with government and the regulator to get the policies in place so that we can unlock money can make a huge difference. To give you a sense of scale, again, we've got a goal to invest about 10 billion of our liquid long-term investment in sustainable sources over the next 5 years. With the right policy framework, the right regulation, we could easily increase that by a factor of 5, more like 50 billion. The private sector can do the heavy lifting, and we're really keen to do that.
But that's quite could we put the lights up, actually, so that I can see anybody who wants to say a question? But that's quite a big if, isn't it? You know, James, we need to have the public policy in place before the money's going to flow.
It is, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work.
No, absolutely. And
I think
your 15 million, that's 15 million you removed from the portfolio. Was that by investing in new things, or was that by divesting from securities and companies that were emitting?
The 10 billion that we're looking to invest in sustainable sources, long-term.
I think you said that you'd reduced your portfolios by 15 million tonnes of CO2.
Oh no, so the portfolio is 15 million tonnes of CO2. We want to reduce that by 25%.
Okay.
So part of that will be tilting, part of it is through stewardship, and then it's also directly investing.
So a mixture of all sorts of different things. That's great. I mean, please do. I'm hoping that we have some questions here, because otherwise you're going to have a whole load of questions from me, which is the last thing that you want. But I'd like to talk a little bit about this mix of policy and finance and what the finance industry is saying. And look, we had the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, $130 trillion, which is a very serious amount of money, and you would have thought, gosh, from amongst those we can find $1 trillion a year to invest in the green projects. But every single one of the people who signed the GFANs, and by the way, 98% of the money under management in Scotland is, I understand, signed up to the Glasgow Finance Alliance, which is, I think, the highest in the world. But the GFANs is all subject to, we make this commitment with the expectation that governments will follow through on all their commitments to ensure the objectives of the Paris Agreement are met. Now, that's kind of, therefore, a commitment and a non-commitment, isn't it? So if somebody else does this for us, then is that right?
I think it's about the pace that you can go on, and it's not just, oh, we'll wait and see, and if they do it, we do it. But you have to obviously be on the front foot and be ready with things like net zero solutions and methodologies, and what will your net zero strategy look like. So we joined the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative last year in GFANS, and thought about all of this and what is the package of what a net zero strategy needs to look like. But ultimately, you'll get to a point where if global emissions and government emissions continue to go up, you can't, in the finance industry, go down at the same time. That you'll get to a point where there won't be sufficient investment opportunities to continue to do that, when it's completely misaligned with the global policy environment. And that's where there is that reliance on, we absolutely need to go a bit like that, one step at a time, but together, or many steps at a time, because they're running out of time. But that's where there is a reliance, that you do need the right incentives and carbon prices and these kind of financial incentives to be able to invest in the necessary solutions.
Chris?
Look, David, net zero commitments are the beginning of the debate. They're not the end of the debate. And GFANS' commitment to $120 trillion is $130 trillion is a big commitment, but it means nothing if it doesn't actually reach the projects, if it doesn't actually get transition finance going. And I think that's the challenge on the back of what happened in Glasgow. It's how do we actually continue to drive forward? The problem with us politicians is that we come and go. You know, we're susceptible to things called the voters. And therefore policies change government by government across the world. So how do we maintain that momentum between now and 2050? You know, many of us in this room, I hesitate to say it, won't be around in 2050. But we can't kick the ball down the road.
I will be in this room. You can
You'll be there.
I don't age.
You'll be there. That's good. But we can't fall into the trap we fall into so often, which is we talk the talk, but we kick the ball down the road. We leave it to somebody else. We say the millennials can sort this. We don't actually have to sort it. We have to sort it. It's us in this room and the finance sector which has to deliver on the commitment.
And do you think, Chris, that the finance sector needs to be a bit noisier with government in saying, listen, you've got to put in clear... I mean, you wanted policies that would last for how long?
Well, what you want is long-term certainty that the policies are going to be there, and it's also reducing the risk.
So for 10 years, 20 years?
Oh, yeah. You want long-term goals. In offshore wind, you start setting goals for 2030, the amount of capacity that's going to be put in.
I totally agree with that. I think we've got to urge governments across the world and the UK government to really commit long-term and to set clear... We need clear targets which are measurable and are transparent in their delivery so that we do away with the greenwashing, that we actually get proper focus around targets. Now, this is a hard thing to do with politicians, and I speak as one, to get them to commit beyond a window, of my case, of 5 years. For many, it's shorter periods of time. But if we don't get political commitment across the world with local action, because global commitment requires local actions on the ground, then we just won't achieve it.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the floor? Good. Can I take one in the second row? The guy with glasses, and any others. There's a guy 3 rows behind. I don't see any women with their hands up, and we've got lots of women in the audience, so I'm hoping we'll balance that. Oh, sorry, I have a hand at the front, so I'll have that question second, and then I'll go to you, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Brian Henderson. I'm the Sustainable Investment Lead for Mercer in UK and Europe. Just a couple of points the panel have raised, and I think these are difficult things to deal with. I've just gone through the process of TCFD reporting for a couple of very, very large pension schemes, and the outcome of that is make me start to question a lot of the net zero commitments I've seen bandied around. So, for example, I've been very fortunate in one arrangement to get scope 3 emissions. But the majority tend to kind of ignore that if you look at them. And scope 3 emissions, as you know, can be an order of magnitude the size of scope 1 and 2. So it's certainly the emissions are being under clubbed, to put it quite mildly. And we also hear schemes and investors talk about in-scope assets. It's absolutely frustrating that they select the assets they want to report on, ignoring all the others. And this comes back to my second point about the government. It's probably my main point, actually, that we're kind of hamstrung by what the government does in this space, particularly in my sphere, where we're looking at investing in billion-pound pension schemes. You know, we end up at a 2050 backstop for net zero, largely because that's what the government says, but yet we can't hold them properly to account here. And by that I mean, if you go to, and I've done this, you go to an investment manager and you ask them, have you spoken to Treasury or whoever puts the bonds out into the marketplace? Have a conversation about how green they are, and will they be green? They don't want to know. It's not in their vocabulary. Yeah.
So big expectations, but actually when you look at the detail
underneath
of it,
the bonnet,
there's a lot of leaks in the dam.
It's a bit light, and I think the hesitancy to invest in green bonds, for example, is a classic case of we can't see what's going on.
Yeah. Question at the front.
Hi, it's Cindy. Without a doubt, I think we'll discuss that, David, to invest in green energy or zero net, we need to invest in truly innovation. and the policy. But still, the gap between invention and true innovation still remain vast. It requires more than smart policies, strategic good incentives, and also good intention to succeed. So for me sitting here, and I would love to see the progression in investment in green energy. And we hear this morning from Leo, I think, that even the private sector not investing in green energy. So what it takes to invest or to enhance the economy or the investment through the policy, through strategic, through good intention and good incentives to progress that type of investments.
So I'm going to ask the two investors that question, but you might also comment on just what we're saying and what we're doing, what we sound like we're saying, and what we're doing are very different, and that's a dangerous thing for us to be doing. What do you
Can I comment on the previous question as well, and then this one? So on data, ultimately, scope 3 in-scope assets, I think as a practitioner going through the process, we've done 3 TCFD reports, we look at our data, absolutely scope 3 is critical. You need to understand your value chain emissions, and then we looked at scope 3 data from our provider, and 90% is estimated. Actually, the disclosure rates are so low on that data that the risk is if you include it in target setting, next year data look completely different because it's now, companies are maybe disclosing more. So really, I know earlier we said disclosure is not sufficient, but it is necessary, and I do think it really is necessary to give us that picture of being able to track progress. Similarly, for in-scope assets, you look at the assets, there is no data at all, and you think, I've got no baseline, so let's have a phased approach where we aim to include those later. That was on the data point. The incentives, I think, are so key because we have, last year at COP26, actually went some really good technology innovation sessions, carbon capture and storage, and marine projects outside of Scotland. And they were making a financial case. And at the end, they always said, well, if the carbon price was at this level, it would be financially viable for investors to get involved and so on. And it comes down to the policy incentives point that for many technologies at an early stage, prototype stage, for investors, it's often not financially viable purely from that perspective to invest. So this policy incentive is absolutely critical.
Just building on the TCFD point, because I totally agree with the difficulty of getting data and that scope 3 data, which is so critical. I think we've seen a real evolution on TCFD, both in terms of increasing the scope of what one's trying to measure, but then also on the scenario analysis. And I think it's really the insights that matter, not necessarily the perfection. And so one of the key insights for me that came out of our TCFD analysis of that 160 billion investment portfolio is that about 20% of the assets are responsible for 90% of the emissions. And they're the sectors where there's the highest transition risk. And so you can start to think about, well, what kind of policy scenarios and market scenarios might affect those sectors, and what difference can we make through our stewardship to help them drive change? And so it's as much the insights that come out of it as the perfection in the data. And innovation is such a critical part of the mix.
Just on the innovation, I mean, we're not putting anything like enough money into climate innovation, are we? I mean, and if you take, if I'll pick on you, Eva. If you take Aberdeen's portfolio, it's invested in secondary securities mainly, wasn't it? I think Leon Cami was saying that from Hermes. We're all invested in secondary securities, and we've got a limited capability to be able to get money to the new venture capital stuff unless companies that we're already invested in are doing that, and we can encourage them to do that. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's fair that the impact you have is different in public market secondary securities, where if you were to sell, somebody else buys the share. But we are invested across different asset classes, including private markets.
So you would have venture capital and all of those sorts of things.
So as you say, there is opportunities for investing in innovation, but also I think through investing in companies that are innovating and recognizing those. So we would see that in the bucket of climate solutions, and actually looking at companies that are doing things that are changing technologies, innovating.
Yeah.
So you can still invest in it in that way.
Fair enough. Let me take some more questions. So there was one gentleman in the fifth row back here. And in fact, I'm going to take 3 questions, and then there's a woman just behind him, and then there's a woman up towards the left at the back, and there's some more questions coming along. So I'm going to try and make sure we get at least these 2 rounds of questions in. So
Great, I'll be quick then. Hi, I'm Ed Mitchard. I'm co-founder of a company called Space Intelligence. We use satellite data to map changes in forest carbon stocks around the world, particularly for nature-based solutions, but also sustainable finance. Yeah, it's coming back to this monitoring point. You said, James, you'd measured the emissions in your portfolio at 15 million tonnes. I'd suggest the scientist in me thinks that's estimated and probably with quite high uncertainty. I was wondering if the asset managers were considering putting more money or a higher proportion into monitoring. So, for example, we produce satellite technology, which is frankly not something that you have the budget for to do for your portfolio companies right now, because you, I think, largely rely on self-reported carbon numbers, and I suspect that's not really going to be good enough to force these companies to drive the change or really understand the emissions in the land use change and the management of land that's embedded in so many of the companies' emissions.
So should there be more money into monitoring? And if we pass the microphone to the person behind you, and then a microphone up there.
Hi, my name's Anne Johnston from North Tree Investment Management. My question's kind of related to Ed's, I think, and also there's threads with the other ones as well. Before COP, I interviewed Chris Stark. North Tree is a real estate fund, so I'm focused on commercial real estate. And I asked Chris a question about what he thought about the definition of a net zero carbon building, because that's something that's really sort of engaging that, my sector at the moment. And he said he didn't think it made any sense at the level of an individual building, that he thought that a net zero target for real estate had to be at that kind of sector level, because, if we're looking at carbon budgets and how we work down from that top-down level. So I suppose my question is, do you think there is enough collaboration? Do you think everybody, obviously we want people to nail their colours to the mast, but is setting net zero targets individually actually fragmenting things too much when we need more collaboration and more kind of cooperation in order to use tools like spatial mapping and the things that Ed's talked about there?
Yeah, because if one person's going to use it, why don't we have everybody using it? And if the goal is that we all get to net zero, we all benefit from getting to net zero, so we should be doing this together. Good question. And then at the back here.
I would like to, Jennifer, again, thank you. Bring it back to the simple question of achieving net zero. And a lot of what we're hearing here is the metrics and the difficulties to really define metrics, to measure them and really assess our performance in that sense. And I wonder if this focus on metrics as opposed to the action at the root causes, seeing these root causes resolved, might be a direction that would move us away from some of these barriers to real action, rather than spending the time focusing on really, I say from the climate science perspective, I left academia because our house is on fire, and when your house is on fire, it feels a bit late to be studying the materials and how quickly they burn.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stop there.
Great question. So there's 2 questions here about metrics and the use of metrics, and I'll ask my investors about this. And then, Chris, if I can bring you in with the investors, which isn't all this metric stuff just getting away from the basic things you need to do?
It's the challenge is when you think the metrics are telling you something, but they're incomplete or may possibly, even be misleading. So I mentioned that earlier when we trial things out, like how do we really measure portfolio alignment and temperature scores, and they're just not giving you the full picture.
And you're not getting the full picture, and it's sort of bamboozling for the customer, isn't it? You've got all of this stuff.
I think there's a real need to kind of consolidate and standardise approaches, and that's why we're really keen to kind of collaborate with others in the market. Things like the PCAF initiative that set out a methodology for measuring financed emissions. We're using that methodology and we can input to it. Things like the Science-Based Targets initiative that's having a standardised way for setting targets. I think that's really important, and then that gives people the framework to talk to the customer in an internally consistent way, and so that you can overcome greenwashing. But I think when talking to customers, because customers are really interested in this, it's important not to use the kind of lingo we've been using this morning, ESG and SBTI and GFA. They're not interested in that. It needs to be a narrative, tell a really interesting story about the fact that we're investing and actively investing in the future that they want to live in, and partnering with people like Make My Money Matter to really bring it to life with new ways of telling that message.
And I wonder as well, James, couldn't we just find some really simple things that we're going to do as asset owners and asset managers? I mean, I talked last night about, we're going through 100 set of the most climate challenged companies in the world. Not a single one of them is making assumptions about the future that are consistent with sustainability. I mean, shouldn't we just say, look, we're not voting through accounts like that any longer? And in 2 years' time, your assumptions have got to, or, similarly, when we're voting for directors, shouldn't we say, look, if you want to stand to be a director of a company, can you say in good faith you'll try and manage it the way the City of London's being managed, which is you will be net zero, actually, by 2040?
Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, I mean, I think the last point about directors, etc., is an important one, because one thing I wanted to highlight, and Tarek mentioned it, and in fact you mentioned it last night at the Global Leaders Dinner, is the route forward is not disinvestment. Disinvestment is cop-out, right? It's actually passing the problem on. What we need is all our directors of all our companies to actually be accountable. And the metrics need to be consistent across the board so that we're all measuring the same things. But disinvestment is no way forward. You've got to stay in there and you've got to hold people accountable. And that's true with politicians as well. Hold politicians' feet to the fire.
As you know, I agree with you on that, and it's a brave thing to say. And if we could bring the industry together, that there were those simple things, I don't know whether that would help answer the question at the back. You've still got your hand up, so maybe not. So tell me. So not just metrics, but thinking about new and different innovatory things. Maybe we can.
I think that's totally spot on, and we've been thinking and struggling with that, to be honest. When a client asks for a specific metric, wants a carbon number to be in a certain way or a temperature number, and we say that's fine, but actually that doesn't tell the full story. And can we maybe give the narrative or give a case study and show in our active ownership, how we are focused on the highest financed emitters and taking action to engage, to vote in a certain direction. So it goes back to the point that it's that full package, and that the metrics, quite often, if you then focus on metrics, you might be biased to invest towards where the data disclosure is good, and that will be in public markets, developed countries, but that's not actually where you want the capital to go. And so that is the real risk. So I think that is a real struggle that we need to resolve in the industry.
And I've only got 30 seconds left, so I really can't take any more questions. I'm ever so sorry, because I thought we were beginning to scratch the surface of some really interesting things there, but I do need to call this to a halt. And I would like to say thank you to our panelists as well, because I think they've been very open, and thank you also to the questioners, because I think they were good and probing questions. But I'm sorry to have to leave it there, but thank you very much, all of you.